Hey, all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe. From character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods, we will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello, and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about all things Dragon Age regarding its lore. I am one of your hosts, Austin, also known as Teacup.
And my name is Shelby, or She Cup.
And now we are continuing in our Season 5, right? Season 5.
Season 5, that's right.
All right. And we're talking about major conflicts in Thedas, and these first couple episodes are about underlying big topics that we need to understand the big conflicts that are coming out. So last week we talked about the Avar and a little bit about the Alamari and their belief systems. Today is not as fun of a topic.
Not at all. Today we're talking about slavery in Thedas, and I do think it's easy for us to think, oh, that's just in Tevinter, which is not really true. I see why people can argue that, but it's not exactly accurate. Slavery had existed in most of Thedas because, as you'll remember from our Tevinter episode, Tevinter as a country had claim to much of Thedas in their prime. So slavery has been in every country in Thedas in some form or another, regardless of whether or not it was connected to Tevinter and all of that. So we're going to talk mostly about Tevinter slavery. We're going to briefly mention other groups that have practiced slavery, and we're going to devote a few minutes to Elven slavery. But most of our content today is going to be about Tevinter.
Right. And so I guess here is your trigger warning for discussions of slavery and racialized violence.
Yeah, like if that's something that's a trigger for you, you are not a bad fan of the Dragon Age Lorecast if you skip this episode. That's okay. If you are a person whose ancestors were enslaved, that is completely okay for you to skip this episode. So slavery in Thedas is actually pretty similar to how slavery in the United States and the Western world worked into the 19th century and in the 17th or 18th century as well. So people, especially elves, are purchased and they're forced to work in varying different places. Some in like forced labor conditions outside with crops, some in household environments, etc. The slave trade in Thedas has actually existed since the ancient age and is pretty common still. We see many traders, slave traders in the games, but slavery is only legal in Tevinter currently. Now, I don't really have fun facts. Let's maybe call it trivia instead for this topic. But I just have two. The first piece of trivia is that most, actually, groups or nations in Thedas have participated in slavery in some way, whether that's like owning slaves and facilitating slavery within their countries, or just participating in the system, the economic system of slavery. Those are two different things. But even if you don't necessarily like allow slavery legally, you can still participate in the system. And we'll get into some of that later. I think that mimics our own world personally. And then my second trivia fact is that the old god Andorral was known as the Dragon of Slaves and the Dragon of Chains. So that's interesting that Tevinter had an old god for the slaves.
Right, but the way it makes it sound is like an old god that keeps you enslaved.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with that. Which again is kind of like opposite to how a lot of slave communities in the United States, like they took the more liberating aspects of Christianity, especially like the liberation of the slaves in Exodus, as like argument for, okay, well, we're going to become Christians and we're going to fight for our freedom from slavery. This is kind of like the opposite of that, I feel like.
Mm.
So, are we ready to get into kind of the background and different kinds of slavery?
Yeah.
So, I think we should start with Elven slavery, as Elven culture is the oldest that we know of currently in Thedas. So, according to Felason and Solus, the ancient elves and, of course, the Evenurus themselves created a class-based system of slavery against their own people. And of course, the Evenurus were at the top of that pyramid. According to the Virdathara Signs of Victory Codex entry, servants and slaves, like the two terminologies, those two words, were and have been used interchangeably. And then during the Solus Romance in Inquisition, he tells you that the Valisleen, which, as we know, are the markings that Dalish elves wear on their faces or get tattooed on their faces that are sacred, are and were actually symbols of slave markings. So this differentiated the elven slaves from the rest of the elven people, and this is all happening in the time of Elvenon. Solus also tells us, and I know that this is kind of Solus heavy already, but most of what we know about elven slavery comes from Solus. But Solus tells us during the height of slavery in Elvenon, Fenharel created a sanctuary for elven refugees and runaways. He tended their wounds and removed their Valisleen, while also telling them the truth about the elven quote unquote gods, which of course is that they aren't really gods at all. Then the former slaves tended to take up arms and join the Dreadwolf's army to fight back against their oppressors. And really, genuinely, that's most of what we know about elven slavery, because we only get 1.5, and Felason talks about it a little bit, but we really only get Solus's perspective on elven slavery.
Yeah. Just one quick thing. It's really interesting to me now, just like kind of reading about it, that Solus is kind of paralleling himself to Andraste. Probably not intentional, but very much putting himself in that liberator savior role in his telling.
I agree. I think it would be just a tad more accurate, though, to say BioWare is writing him as a parallel to Andraste, because I think that may be intentional.
Probably.
But let's move into Tevinter. This is going to be the big bulk, I think, of our content today. So slavery in Tevinter was really established when the Elven homeland was invaded and destroyed. As we know, we've talked about this. We've established this on this podcast multiple times in the past. So I'm not going to get into the history again, but Tevinter essentially conquered and enslaved the elves that survived the destruction of Elvenon and Arlathon. And then they became the slaves of Tevinter. And it's been that way ever since. There have been groups and rebellions, groups that have left and rebellions throughout the years, but there's still a mass number of elves that are enslaved in Tevinter to the modern day. Okay, so like when I did this research a month, maybe 2 months ago, I posted in our Discord and was like, y'all are making me do math for the research for this podcast, and this is where the math comes in. So if anybody remembers that, you can thank me now. But at the height of Tevinter slavery, we know from Codex entries that the enslaved population in Tevinter numbered in the millions. So I wanted to know what the comparison was to slavery in the United States. So the height of slavery in the United States was, I would argue, just before the Civil War. So the closest date we have to that is about 1860, and we have census records from 1860. So according to the 1860 census for the United States, the slave population in the U.S. was around 4 million slaves. Again, we know that at the height of Tevinter slavery, the stat just says the slaves numbered in the millions. So we don't know the exact population numbers of Tevinter at that time, at the height of slavery. But here are some other statistics that we do know. Number one, the Ferelden current population is around 1 million. That means also we know that the Denerim population is around 70,000 and the High Ever population is around 20,000. We also know that Minrathous is Tevinter's largest city, and it's also Thedas's largest city. We also know that Val Royeaux's alienage alone has a population of 10,000, and that Orzamar's population is around 100,000. So those are some things we do know. Did you have something to add first?
Just that these numbers seem low to me based on the size of these places in game. I know they're not highly populated areas, like from a gameplay standpoint, but 70,000 is not that many people. I mean, it is and it isn't. Like, there are things that are called small cities that are much more than 70,000 people.
Yes. Yeah, that's fair. I don't have any opinion on that because I'm guesstimating so much with the math that I'm fixing to tell you about. I'm guesstimating based on the statistic of Val Royeaux's alienage at 10,000. I think their city is well into the hundreds of thousands. And Ferelden's population is at 1 million. And at Denerim's population, you have to think about we just had a blight a few years ago. So their population is around 100, a little bit less than 100,000. So I'm guesstimating that Tevinter's current population is well between 2 to 3 million people and maybe a little bit higher too. So that leads me to think that the Tevinter population was probably larger at the height of their empire, right? So then I bumped that up to about 4 to 5 million population in Tevinter at the height of their slavery. Now that number would not include slaves. We know that the slave population in Tevinter was in the millions. So if it was like 10 million, they would say in the tens of millions. And if it was just like 1 million, they would just say 1 million. So somewhere between 2 to 9 million slaves in Tevinter at the height of slavery, right? So that would be somewhere between 1 slave per free person to 2 slaves per free person in Tevinter at the height of slavery. So this is finally when I'm comparing it to the United States. To compare, the United States population in 1860 was 31 million people with 4 million slaves. That is 1 slave for every 7 people. That is stark. Thinking about just how many slaves are enslaved in Tevinter at the height of slavery.
When you think about Tevinter and versus the U.S., we know that the U.S. was mainly bringing slaves from one place, and then one continent. And when the transatlantic slave trade ends, you're not bringing any more slaves, but the people who are born into slavery are still enslaved. So, but Tevinter, it makes sense for me that their numbers are bigger because they're pulling slaves from all around Thedas. They enslaved people from Orlais, they enslaved people from Ferelden, or what will become Ferelden, the free marches in Tevinter, the almost the entire Elven population.
I do have 2 things to say to that, one in real history and one in Thedas history, because first, in Thedas, like, we're talking about the height of slavery in Tevinter, so not just now, which I would think at the height of slavery in Tevinter, They may have been getting slaves from everywhere, but I feel like the height was probably closer to their conquering of Arlathon and Elvenon, which would have been they were getting their slaves like from those people that weren't killed. But also, going back to your point about slavery in the United States, like most slaves came from Africa was your argument, but I don't really think that's true, because the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in 1808 and the Civil War didn't happen until the 1860s. So that's 50 years of slavery and large amounts of slavery that they weren't importing people from Africa. By that point in time, hereditary slavery had become so entrenched into American society that they were just gaining new slaves by reproduction. So at the same time, I see where you're coming from, and also I kind of disagree. So those are my two things that I wanted to say back to you.
I'm not going to make you do more math, but I would be curious how this compares with the height of the Roman Empire slave statistics. I was just going to say, I know we probably don't have as cohesive of numbers as we do from 1860, just because the census was happening. But I would just be curious, like, because there's so much obvious that Tevinter shares with both the United States and its history and the Roman Empire.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I briefly did actually look into Roman stats and I just couldn't find them. I'm sure they do have some stats in behind academic paywall journals. And I'm sorry, y'all, I'm not paying money to get details from academic journals because that's expensive. But I just thought these statistics were interesting. And I think that we can make the argument that Tevinter enslaves a higher portion of the population than the United States did during slavery. I think that that's really significant. And I think that illustrates perfectly to me how evil Tevinter slavery really is. It's not just some cutesy thing that we can look over because, oh, this magister's gay and hot and we want to date him in our dating sim video game.
Right. And I think this brings up a question, and we could talk about it more. I don't want to answer it, but in Dragon Age Inquisition and a little bit in Dragon Age Absolution, spoilers for that, there is this kind of sympathy that's trying to be driven for Tevinter. And so my question is Tevinter worthy of sympathy with this without changing fundamentally who they are?
I mean, I think it's always worthy. It's always worth it to have sympathy and empathy for the people who live under these systems who are oppressed. So it's always worth it to have sympathy and empathy for the enslaved population of Tevinter. It's always worth it to me to have sympathy and empathy for people like Crem, who grew up in poor families and sold themselves to the military so their family wouldn't be sold into slavery. For people like that, it's always worth it to me. I think the big question that we can wrestle with as a fandom, I don't think we're going to have an answer on this tonight or today in this episode. The question, though, is can we have sympathy and empathy for magisters? That's the real question. And now, of course, we do have magisters like Dorian and Maevaris who are working to make Tevinter a better place, to repent of those sins, if you want to make it Christian. So there's that, but by and large, most Tevinter magisters, they own slaves. They have slaves. They're okay with slavery. So I think that that's an important question you bring up. Did you have more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that question is going to continue in our fandom a lot, especially in the thing of Tevinter was introduced to us as a villain.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, is there a chance for sympathy to override that and Tevinter not be a villain without fundamentally changing who then the privileged people of that nation are?
Right. I mean, I think this is something that I have deep concerns about for Dragon Age Dreadwolf, because I will be really disappointed if, Dreadwolf is set in Tevinter and they decide to kind of sanitize Tevinter slavery and not show us like, okay, this is horrific, and not show us characters fighting back. And instead, we're like working with magisters and we don't get to push back against their slavery opinions. Like, that will be something I'm deeply, deeply disappointed by. And I don't know. I'm not sure I could continue supporting BioWare if that was the direction they chose.
Same.
Anyway, let's move on. And let's talk about the one and only, the latest, greatest Kirkwall. I feel like it always comes back to this damn city. But anyway, Kirkwall was once a colony of Tevinter. You may or may not know that, but it was. And even Kirkwall even became part of Tevinter proper during the Ancient Age. As you can probably guess from the imagery throughout the city, it was once the center of the Tevinter slave trade and was the site of Tevinter's largest quarry. Now, Kirkwall is positioned on the Waking Sea, and it has very, very easy access to the Amaranthine Ocean that then allows them to get to other parts of Thedas by boat. This is clearly and obviously why Kirkwall is desirable as not only a port city, but as the center of Tevinter slave trade. So I brought a quote from the Codex in Dragon Age 2 on the gallows. And I think that this shows us how blood-soaked Tevinter really is, or how blood-soaked Kirkwall really is. We talked about this on Kirkwall's episode. I don't think we read this specific Codex entry, but I want to bring it back up because it's really important. And then we can kind of understand even more about why it's so messed up that the mages are housed in the gallows. Anyway, so this is the quote. The Imperium's hunger for expansion led to legions of slaves forced into working the quarry. When the Empire's construction phase ended, Kirkwall slid naturally into its new role as the capital of the slave trade, and the gallows at its heart. The statues are not monuments to the suffering of slaves. Every inch and angle of the courtyard was designed by magisters bent on breaking the spirit of newcomers. Executions here took place daily, sometimes hourly, and corpses were hung from gibbets throughout the yard. New slaves trudging in from the docks saw what awaited them. When Our Lady turned her armies against the Imperium, the slaves of Kirkwall revolted and claimed the city for themselves. The gallows stood empty for 200 years, not to be reopened until the crowning of Divine Justinia I. The gallows transformed the city again when the abandoned prison tower became the home of Kirkwall's circle. End quote. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, why in Andraste's holy name did they ever think putting the circle there was a good idea?
I agree. I very much agree.
I know Andraste, if we discount her being a mage theory, I know that according to the Chantry, Andraste did not have a very positive view of magic, at least according to them.
According to the Chantry. Yes. That's very important. According to the Chantry.
But if we take the actual people that she was from and grew up in the philosophies that exist in the Avar tribes, which are their ancestral things, she probably had a much healthier view of magic. I feel like if Andraste got her choice, she would tear the gallows down, burn it down, salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. Why would they put these people that they claim that they're going to care for into this place that is forever a symbol of oppression and slavery? There's no wonder that this whole thing, the Kirkwall incident, happened. I could have been back in time when this happened and says, this isn't going to be good.
Exactly.
Sometimes I think at this point we do kind of have to write it to a fact of this is like a product of the order in which video game decisions are made, in that, okay, here is the mages are going to be in Kirkwall. That decision was probably going to be made first. And then they're like, oh, we need a place to go. Okay, well, Kirkwall has these gallows. There's this whole theme of slavery and oppression that we're doing in this game. Okay, here's the history of the gallows.
Right. No, I
And
agree with that.
and at that point, with Dragon Age 2's Rust development, there's not time to go back and think, is this really what they would do?
Right. And like also, it's just kind of the nature of storytelling. Like you expand when you can. And that's fine. But let's move on and talk about more things about Tevinter slavery. So the frustrating thing that we are coming into here is that we don't quite know what Tevinter slavery looks like because we've never been to Tevinter yet. We've gotten some ideas from Tevinter Knights, but even that, I'm not sure that we can say this is what it looked like because we only have a few examples and like we're just not sure if that's everything, right? But I think with Fenris's kind of thoughts and stuff, which we'll talk about soon in his character deep dive. So I don't want to spoil things for that, but we can kind of make some assumptions and we can have some ideas. So here are some things that slaves did, some of their jobs. So there were obviously slaves who were in the kitchen and like in-house slaves, similar to the way it was in the United States. They also have slaves that are dedicated to outdoor landscaping jobs, as well as educated slaves or slaves who could write would often serve as scribes. Most slaves built many of the oldest cities and temples in Thedas. A lot of them, unfortunately, were sacrificed to the old gods. And then lastly, a lot of slaves are used quite what's the word? Like shallowly, without another thought, as sacrifices in blood magic rituals. And I would also be remiss if I didn't talk about the sexual assault of slaves. That's something that is pretty common in under slavery, unfortunately, and Fenris hints also that that's something that he suffered through too. So those are some things, some jobs that the slaves had, ways that they worked or were forced to work. But I don't want to end Tevinter slavery on this note. I want to go to slave rebellions and slave revolts. I wish that I had enough content to kind of give this its own episode, but we just don't know enough. But yes, Austin, you had a question.
You might have covered it and I just missed it earlier, but are children of slaves born into that caste system in Tevinter?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is why it's very similar to American slavery.
Right. And so, I mean, really, in current Thedas right now, Orzammar and Tevinter are the only places that have like established caste system. I mean, you have Orlais with their nobility, but I feel like that's more similar to what we experience in a large gap between the nobility and upper class and the middle class and lower and poor.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we have enough evidence or proof to like claim that yet.
Right. So I was just curious
sure
about that.
Well, let's get into slave rebellions briefly, and then we'll go to our mid-break. So, during the first exalted march against Tevinter, which is also known as Andraste and Mafarath's war against Tevinter, a group of elven slaves led by Shartan freed themselves. They then allied with Andraste, and Shartan dedicated himself to the emancipation of all the elves from slavery. His role was detailed in the Canticle of Shartan, which was once a part of the Chant of Light. After the Exalted March to the Dales, this part of the Chant of Light was struck from the record. It was made dissonant, is what they call it. But his role was originally in the Chant of Light, and it was very important. You can learn more about Shartan, his role in the Elven slave rebellion that led him to Andraste by going and listening to our very first season, specifically episode 3, and it's all about Andrastianism. We covered Shartan as our side character for that episode. Or you can also stay tuned. In the next month, we're going to be talking about that Exalted March. So we'll cover him again, not quite as in detail, but we will talk about him again. And then also the last thing I want to talk about with Tevinter is that slavery was once briefly abolished, but this was quickly, very quickly overturned. The ruling Archon was assassinated and the status quo went back to Tevinter's normal within like 5 years. It was a very, very short amount of time. And I think that this shows you just how intrinsic slavery and its system is to Tevinter.
Yeah, I think this is an example of, unfortunately, when these systems have these long histories in a society, they're very, very difficult to overturn. Um, and if you move too quickly, if you move too hastily and without caution, sometimes the system itself is going to push back against you. And kind of like, with Newton's third law, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Similar thing going on here.
Right, absolutely. And I think, again, this is another way that Tevinter slavery mimics our world, because if you've studied history at all, which Civil War history is a vast topic and a popular topic in historical studies, but what happened after the Civil War? The economy crashed. The South was in shambles. Reconstruction happened. Like, we almost had another civil war. It was really rough on the economy, as it should have been, frankly. But you can't just completely overturn like your economic system without having some effects. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of times when we choose to do something that's right, like abolish unjust systems, we don't always take the effects on how that might affect us into play. But this is something that you need to think about, frankly, if you're doing something like that. But clearly that Archon in Tevinter did not take that into consideration.
Right. And if you want more, like I do talk about this fairly often, especially in our Who Would Make the Best Divine episode. And I talk about each divine and which one I think would actually make the most systemic change for the long term.
Well, I think now is a good time to go to our mid-break.
Yeah, let's do it.
Hawk stepped in the poopy.
I love you.
Want a sandwich?
All this for me. And I didn't get Alexius anything.
Send him a fruit basket. Everyone loves those.
All right, welcome to the middle of the show where we talk about all things about the podcast, but not about the lore. And so it is at this point that I thank our patrons. A special thank you to our first patrons, Lisa M., Derek B., and Genesis. Also a special thank you to Divine Tier Kit, and a very, very, very special thank you to the one and only Nug King, Lewis H. Thank you all for your support. Thank you to every patron who supports us. We greatly appreciate it. If you would like to join us on Patreon, you can sign up. Their link is in the episode description. And if you sign up at the first Enchanter tier or higher, you'll join us on our patron episode once a month. And if you want to join us on our patron chat, you can sign up for the first Enchanter tier or higher, and you can join us once a month and hang out with us there. If you can't join our Patreon, we totally understand. We know not everyone is able to do that. But another great way to help and support us is to leave us rating and reviews on Apple and Spotify. If you leave us 5 stars with some words, some kind words, we will read them out on a future episode of the show. And so we greatly appreciate that support. And last but not least, please join our Discord. We hang out there. We do a lot of stuff. We can share our playthroughs, our theories, talk about other games, talk about our other podcast shows. It's a great place to be. And speaking of the Discord, we do have a Hero Hawk or Herald to share today.
Yeah, we do. And this one is from Bird, who recently became one of our newest patrons. I don't know if we've actually shouted them out yet as a new patron. So Bird, thank you so much for becoming a patron if we haven't. But Bird says this about their Hero Hawk or Herald. I'm listening to both lorecasts and seeing so many parallels between Dragon Age and Assassin's Creed. I made my Elf Inquisitor Eivor from Assassin's Creed Valhalla after being inspired by the visions Eivor has and being like, oh, hey, that could be Solus. So Alana Wolf-Kissed Llewellyn is a warrior two-handed weapon with no class specializations. Born in 901 Dragon, nicknamed Abs by Varric, the greatest fear is drowning trapped underneath ice. She likes flowers and is unexpectedly good at strategy games and investigation, though Alana definitely prefers drinking games, and tests of strength. If Alana had a D&D class, it would be a totem warrior or ancestral guardian barbarian. As a child, Alana's parents were murdered by a rival clan. They were seen as betrayers of the Dalish for attempting to make an alliance and joining forces with an Avar tribe. Saved from the initial battle by her older brother figure, the Avar leader's boy, Alana had fallen on a frozen lake and was attacked by a starving wolf. After a very strange vision, Alana managed to kill the wolf, but nearly drowned and froze to death when the ice broke underneath them. Saved and brought back to the surviving Avar, Alana was adopted into the tribe. Growing up, Alana couldn't let go of the past and eventually became a bloodthirsty marauder who was out for vengeance, and the Avar were forced to exile her. It wasn't until meeting Keeper Dashana that Alana reconciled with her past and reconnected to her Dalish roots, finally receiving her Valisline, taking on the symbols of June to signify a time of creation instead of destruction. Events happening so quickly, one after the other, tears in the Fade, time travel, political machinations, all of the things that happen in Inquisition. It was only in Solas's company where Alana found any solace in these progressively chaotic times. But as with all things the Avar believe in, and Alana was accustomed to living by, all things are temporary, nothing is permanent. The couple's time together came to an end. Alana kept her Valisline, and her parting words to Solas were cold. "You're hurting yourself far more than me." And then Bird also sketched out their character because in-game doesn't let you do muscles on elves. Very relevant content right there. So you can definitely go and check out Bird's Inquisitor in the Discord. You should join the Discord. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And as our resident Assassin's Creed lore master, I greatly appreciate the Eivor reference there. I think that's a lot of fun. But I liked the backstory of coming into the Dalish clan instead of what's given there. I like that a lot.
I loved that so much. I'm going to make Ezio in Dragon Age next time.
Ooh, human noble.
Yeah, or Connor. I could do Connor. Or I could do Aveline or Aya or Bayek or I could make Cassandra, but I can't make her romance Cassandra, and that is the ultimate travesty. Anyway, let's move on from this, please.
Basically, you want to make a same name lesbian couple.
That's right. I'm going to look that up. I bet that's in fan fiction.
I mean, I don't know what the equivalent of Rule 43 is for fan fiction, but it exists.
I think
there's
exists.
A fanfic.
Yeah, for sure. So let's move on. Let's get back to the show.
Up there, giant icicle tits. Tittles.
You're looking for titsicles.
Oh, that's good.
Yes, and it's a real nice night for an evening.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
So let's talk about other groups, other nations, and how they participated in slavery. This will be shorter just because we don't know as much, but let's get into it nonetheless. So let's talk about the dwarves first and foremost. We do know that the dwarves practiced slavery in their ancient dwarven empire. We just don't know exactly what it looked like, but we do know that it existed. And I think you can make the argument, a convincing argument, that Caridin's creation of the Anvil of the Void, which was used by Dwarven King Valtor, created slavery because it forced the casteless criminals and political enemies into slavery by forcing them to become golems. And of course, that's not why Caridin created it. He intended it to be volunteer only. And it was the King Valtor who created basically dwarven slavery in that method. But I do think that that is a form of slavery, not quite as insidious or entrenched as Tevinter slavery is, but a form nonetheless. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that this is where you need to like really kind of define your definition of slavery, because I would argue that even being born casteless in its of itself is you are enslaved basically to your caste.
That's a really great point. I hadn't thought about that. And I think you're absolutely right. When talking about slavery in this episode, have really strictly stuck to the idea that slavery is something that you are forced into or born into, that you are forced to like work for a person, that you're owned by another person. Casteless aren't necessarily owned by another person, even though they are forced into their situations. But I'd very much agree with you, that I think you can make the argument that the caste system in Orzammar is a form of slavery. That's absolutely true. Right. And then let's move on to Orlesians a little bit. Although the slave trade and slavery is technically illegal, there are some nobles in Orlais who do own elven slaves. And then the Qunari, I think you can make the argument that the Qunari enslave their mages. And they also enslave those who refuse to convert to the Qun, who they've captured, like in war and stuff. And that's because they essentially use, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the chemical thing, to essentially lobotomize both mages, captured mages, and anyone who won't convert to the Qun. And then this is basically turned into mindless labor forces, and they call that Vidoth Bas. And we see that a lot in Tevinter Nights. We see that a lot in the comics.
Yeah. I'm just kind of like stuck on the Orlesians having elven slaves. Of course, they have elven slaves because they're Orlesian. But I've just been thinking about the chantry and all of this, and I have for a long time said that it would not be the treatment of mages that causes Andraste to burn down the modern day chantry. It would be the treatment of elves, and I think it would also be their indifference to slavery, because at some level they are indifferent. According to their religious tenets, they should be marching down and burning down Tevinter for enslaving people. And I get to this point, I'm reading this Star Wars book series, and across the galaxy, there's a bunch of slave revolts happening. And the Jedi are wrestling with this question of, what do we do? What's our role here? Because they technically do serve the Galactic Alliance. And they're doing that. And I just kind of follow the point of, you have a responsibility, with, to quote Spider-Man, with great power, there will also come great responsibility. And I think that's here to the true for the Chantry. The Chantry is doing a great disrespect and ignorance of their founder in not moving against slavery in Thedas.
I very much agree with you. And we've long said that on this podcast, that the treatment of elves was something intrinsic to Andraste's first war, that she treated elves with respect, with not just respect, like as equals. And so the fact that the Chantry hasn't since like the Towers Age, the Second Age, is absolutely like a foundation of heresy, frankly, to Andraste. So I absolutely agree with you, and I think that's correct. But let's move on a little bit, because I don't want us to get too off topic. We could rant about the Chantry all day. But the last other group or nation that is involved in slavery that I want to mention is Antivan Crows. As we know from Zevran, the Crows regularly purchase recruits, train them, and make them crows, and they don't allow them to leave, ever. I would argue that's a form of slavery.
Totally, 100%. And, we could make the argument that the Grey Wardens also participate in a form of slavery, if we want to talk about this through the rite of conscription.
Yeah, I think that's fair too. That's a fair point. Let's move on into talking about the modern day, though. we know that slavery is still practiced in Thedas. We just mentioned a few different ways, and obviously it's still legal in Tevinter. But I do have a quote from another codex. This one's a little overloaded with codex entries, but it says, this is from the codex Slavery in the Tevinter Imperium. And this is my quote. Slavery still thrives in Thedas, even if the trade has been outlawed. Who hasn't heard the tales of poverty-stricken elves lured into ships by the prospect of well-paying jobs in Antiva, only to find themselves clapped in leg irons once at sea? And humans fall prey to this too. If they're lucky, they end up in Orlais, which only has quote-unquote servants. Most nobles treat them decently because they're afraid of admitting the truth. Orlesians go to great lengths to maintain the fiction that slavery is illegal. Of course, the greatest consumer of slave labor is the Tevinter Imperium, which would surely crumble if not for the endless supply of slaves from all over the continent. There, they are meat, chattel. They are beaten, used as fodder in the endless war against the Canari, and they even serve as components in dark magic rituals. So this is a codex quote, not about the historical slavery. This is about modern day slavery throughout Thedas and in Tevinter. They want us to think everything has changed, but it hasn't. It's still the same as it always was.
And if you want to see just a good telling of kind of the effect of modern day slavery in Tevinter, go watch Absolution. Get on Netflix. Go watch it is literally 3 hours to watch all of Absolution. And they'll tell you a lot of what you need to know about slavery and how deep it goes in Tevinter. And I think that this goes to our point of Tevinter overturning slavery for that brief point and it coming back, and how like intrinsic it is. Because not only do they lose a labor force, they've now lost a military force, and they've now lost their ability to use magic. Like, you are getting at the core of who they are and striking at the economy, at their military, and about their power. It's going to be very hard to undo that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple more things about modern slavery before we get into known slave owners and slaves. So obviously, Tevinter slavers often travel to other nations to purchase or capture slaves. We've seen that in game. In the ancient age, Tevinter slaves were mostly elven. Now, though, they're a mix of mostly elves and humans, but dwarves, Canari, and all kinds of mages can also be slaves. It's very common in Tevinter also for free people to choose to sell themselves into slavery. They do this to provide for their families. There's a lot of economic levels in Tevinter. But those slaves who are purchased by the Imperium itself rather than private individuals are called servus publicus, or state-owned slaves. This is a little bit different of a category than just like your regular imported elf.
For an example, if I owed a lot of money in debt, I could go to the state of Tevinter and say, I'll be a slave to pay this off and leave my family alone.
Yeah, but you couldn't like get out after your debt is paid off, basically. The way that it was like in our world back in the 1700s in Europe. Like debtors' prisons, that was a thing. That's not a thing there. You just become a slave. But there are a few other things that slaves can and can't do. So they cannot marry each other just out of their own free will. They have to get permission. And of course, they cannot be set free unless the owner appears before a judge. Emancipated slaves then are known as the liberati. This is a subclass in Tevinter, and they have very limited rights. They are not considered citizens, and they cannot join the military, and they do not have a say in government. So not only are slaves a oppressed class, but freed slaves are also an oppressed class. So I guess the most you can hope for if you're a freed slave is for your child then to later grow up and get a bump up in class after you die. And then last but not least, I want to mention that slave revolts are extremely common. They've even developed their own language, and there are pictures used to communicate that are similar to hieroglyphics. And this is something I hope we get more about. I hope we can become an instigator of slave revolts in DAD. That would be awesome. And we can help them get free, basically. But we'll just have to wait and see on that front. Are we ready to move into known slaves and slave owners?
Let's do it.
Okay, so there's quite a few of both category. Fun facts. So known slaves are Fenris, Andraste, the father of the city elf hero of Ferelden, Fiona, Orana, Shartan, Talus, Valendrian, who's the leader of the Denerim alienage in Origins, and Zevran, to the Antivan Crows. So those are not just random side characters. Those are main characters. Those are party members and companions. Those are Jesus figures. Those are important people in Thedas.
And can you not let Fenris be sold to slavery?
You can. This was not an exhaustive list. This was just a few. And then we also have some known slave owners, and some of you might be disappointed by this list, but just bear with me. So Hallward Pavus and Aquinia Thalrossian, and by extension, Dorian Pavus. Bronca, if you give her the Anvil of the Void in Origins. Caridin as the creator of the Anvil of the Void. Caladrius, a slave trader in Origins, Denarius, Hadriana, Hawk, if they choose to take Orana as an unpaid servant, Isabella, transported slaves, Maevaris Talani, dreams of her life in the Fade. There are slaves all around her, and claims that, quote, everyone in Tevinter has slaves. So again, these are not one-off people. These are very popular characters. These are very important characters. These are party members and companions and romance options.
It's a big problem in Thedas.
It's a huge problem in Thedas. A huge problem, if not one of the biggest, if not number one biggest problem in Thedas.
How do you feel about the potential of a slave origin in Dreadwolf?
Me personally?
Yeah, just curious.
I think that if it's done well, it could be really powerful and potentially my favorite origin of all time. But it worries me a little bit if it could be done well. I feel like Inquisition, with some of the dialogue options, the topic of slavery was not handled well. So that makes me nervous for Dreadwolf generally when it comes to slavery in Tevinter. So a slave, origin makes me nervous. But I said in one of our patron chats that a slave origin, I think that it could be interesting. It could be an interesting origin. What do you think?
I tend to agree with you. I go back and forth because I'm kind of on the fence, because with it being set in Tevinter, I think that we don't get a good picture of Tevinter if we cannot experience it from a slave's perspective. If it is done poorly, it will do way more harm than good that it'll ever do.
Yes, I very much agree. That's a very good point. We may have to revisit this topic after Dreadwolf.
Yeah, definitely.
But let's move into our side character, and we can have any final wrap-up thoughts after this side character. I intentionally left this person out of the list of known slaves because I didn't want to spoil. But today's side character is Calpurnia. Now, Calpurnia is a human magister from Tevinter, but she was once also a slave. So, are we ready to dig into it?
Yeah, let's go.
So, Calpurnia was sold into slavery as a child, and she later became the vessel for Cremisius during the events of Inquisition. There are no official records of her life prior to becoming a slave. Calpurnia's life as a slave was under many different magisters, but eventually she landed under Magister Erasthenes. This magister was a scholar of the old gods. He lived in Minrathus. and he was eventually approached by Cremisius because of his scholarly work. However, while Cremisius is there, he becomes very interested in Calpurnia. He ends up binding Erasthenes the way you would a spirit, and he takes Calpurnia to his side, which is how she becomes the leader of the Venatori. Calpurnia truly believed, however, that the Venatori were the key to saving and improving Tevinter. Interestingly, she never saw the Venatori in the same way that many other Tevinters and Southerners saw the Venatori. She saw them as the key to revitalizing the Imperium rather than just restoring the old ways. She even used her position to free many slaves, and she created a network of spies that were loyal to her and her alone, not the Venatori. And she also killed many Venatori members that were unnecessarily cruel to their slaves. So while it's easy to think, oh, Calpurnia, Tevinter Magister, servant of Cremisius, evil slave owner, that's not the full story. But back to Calpurnia's childhood. Before her magic manifested, she was viewed as talented. She taught herself to read with books in Erasthenes' library, and she showed particular interest in learning about Tevinter history. When she began displaying magic, however, Magister Erasthenes set aside his own scholarly ambitions for a time and began to teach her the ways of magic and Tevinter. Once she could control her magic, he went back to his studies. It's in this boredom that Calpurnia meets, befriends, and becomes very close to Marius. If you don't remember, Marius is one of the main characters of the Mage Killer comic series. Now, the name Calpurnia is interesting. It's interesting for a lot of different reasons, actually, because she chose her name. And it comes from the legend of the first Archon of Tevinter, and this was Archon Dorinius. Apparently, Dorinius's mother was named Calpurnia as well, spelled a little differently, but Calpurnia, the side character, named herself with a name that has deep connections to ancient Tevinter. So I wanted to read a little bit from her codex entry. It says this: I had never heard of Calpurnia before I joined the Venatori. Tevinter circles have no record of a mage of that name, so I thought her perhaps a magister from one of the old houses who took a false title. Calpurnia appears to have no background at all, however, and offers no hints to her past. She is too shrewd to flatter, even if she did not spend half her hours training as her master's star pupil should. So she's not a black and white character. And we also see her in a lot of different places. We see her in Mage Killer. We see her in a short story named Paying the Ferryman. We see her in Inquisition. So we see her in 4 different places, or 3 different places. So let's chat about Mage Killer quickly. Mage Killer is a comic, and this is where we see Calpurnia and Marius together. They're reunited. He's been assigned to kill her by Archon Redonus. This obviously doesn't happen, and they do share a romantic reunion. So then she uses her network of spies to smuggle Marius and Tessa, his accomplice, out of Tevinter, and then they end up joining with the Inquisition later on. And then there's also a short story about her named Paying the Ferryman. It was written by Joanna Barry, who's the same person who wrote the Paper and Steel short story about Samson. So let me sum up the story, and then I have some quotes. It's a short story about her life and childhood as a slave, specifically. It goes into briefly her previous homes and masters before Erasthenes, and then deeply into her time in Erasthenes' home. Throughout the story, she wrestles with her identity, her magic, and Tevinter's failings. She also continually visits the ferryman. We learn close to the end of the story that the ferryman is a statue of Archon Dorinius, the first Archon, whose mother she named herself after. She reveres Dorinius and finds similarities between her and him. And then the story also details at the end how she met Cremisius and became his right hand. Here's a very long quote. I just wanted to read this passage. It's really thought-provoking to me. Quote, "Something about Calpurnia made her masters uneasy, and it stayed their hand when they could have lashed her senseless. Instead, she was the one ordered to run errands in the more unsavory areas of the city, clean mysteriously sealed rooms, or take messages after nightfall out past the proving grounds. She went cautiously but without arguing. Calpurnia didn't fear darkness or whispers from empty rooms, nor in time the strange dreams that came to her. The other slaves were not as accepting of peculiar things. Quote, "You were talking in your sleep last night," a kitchen girl accused her one evening as she returned to the quarters exhausted and footsore. Weird words, not Tevin. Maybe I was. I don't remember. It's not natural, one of their master's bath attendants added, folding his arms across his massive chest. But I can't help what I dream. You can help where you dream, someone else said. Go on out into the stables. We don't want that in here. She went and huddled in the straw while the tears in her eyes stung worse than any whipping. She had no family, no house, no one in the world but her fellow slaves, and they didn't even seem to realize their importance. On her errands, she saw how slavery was the blood and breath of Minrathous, even while many slaves in their despair stopped thinking of themselves as people. Some stopped thinking at all. She would have said more about it in the quarters, but they all stared at her instead of listening. Whatever strangeness her masters sensed about her unsettled the other slaves too. End quote. What do you think about that, Austin?
I think it kind of shows a little bit of slaves in Tevinter, particularly Minrathous, don't want to rock the boat. Like there is this fear of don't draw attention to yourself, don't be strange, don't be weird, don't even be close to something that's strange and weird.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Is a survival, and like we can't blame them for that. It is a survival instinct and is often common among severely oppressed groups.
Yeah, for sure. So I have one more passage I want to read from this short story, and then we can move on. So this is what this next passage says. The more she learned of Tevinter's history, the more she began to see the same indifference everywhere in modern Minrathous. At least slaves had good reasons to be preoccupied. The magisterium, however, chased petty grudges, forgetting that Minrathous' walls still had cracks from the last Kunari assault. The great juggernaut golems Anidatus was meant to restore were silent, and their empire grew moss between its flagstones. But what did that matter so long as this week's rival was humiliated? The greatest empire in Thedas, forged by ancient heroes, and the magisterium took it for granted. They did not pay for what they had. Your mages, Calpurnia wanted to scream when Erasthenes invited visiting scholars or his peers over to drink fragrant tea, play chess, or gossip. The ancients built the greatest empire in Thedas with wisdom and conquest. Now the only ones who must sacrifice for Tevinter are slaves, while you spend all your time on frippery. The chant was right. When you can do anything you wish, why do you do nothing? End quote.
You know, like that frustrating point when someone is so close to like wisdom and the truth, but they're not taking that step to really embrace it.
One more step, Calpurnia. Like abolition is less than 3 inches away. You just have to take one more step, girlfriend. Yeah, it's very frustrating, but it really, like, I think if she had more time to develop or, like, you know, it was a real person, she would get there eventually. Of course, she doesn't get that chance in the game, but as we'll get into in a minute with Inquisition, we do see her getting there. So let's move into that. You meet Calpurnia if you side with the Templars, meeting her for the first time in Haven when she's at Cremisius' side. If you side with the mages, of course, you never meet her, which is why you should side with the Tevinters. You should side with the Templars from time to time because her story is just as interesting as Samson's.
What happens? What happens to Samson if you side with?
I think they die. I'm not sure, but I think they die.
All right.
like all the other potential heroes of Ferelden. Like if you are a city elf, the Dalish elf dies because Duncan's there with you. I think that's the situation, but I'm not 100% sure. But in Inquisition, after you meet her in Haven, Liliana, of course, wants to investigate her. In this quest, the Inquisitor goes to the Val Royeaux home of a Tevinter slave owner named Vicinius. His home is a wreck, but you can find 3 pieces of a memory crystal. Then when Dagna helps you put it back together, we learn that Calpurnia killed Vicinius for abusing the slaves that she purchased from him. And there are also recorded images of Corypheus and Calpurnia discussing her journey to become the vessel. It shows us that she does not fully trust Corypheus.
This scene always makes me laugh because the reason Liliana wants to investigate Calpurnia is because she's never heard of her.
Yes.
And she's so baffled that there is a person that exists that she's never heard of.
And it's because there are no records of her. There are no records of her childhood pre-slavery. And then she takes on a different name. So it's like there's just no records of her. She basically just blips into existence with no historical record whatsoever. Like she doesn't have a birth certificate. It's kind of crazy. So anyway, with the Venatori out scouting elven ruins, Inquisition agents are able to plant half of the crystal in Calpurnia's camp to obviously spy on her. And then we get more recording details that basically show her request to train at the shrine of Dumont, and Corypheus refuses her, claiming that, quote, only Dumont's faithful may enter. Calpurnia then discovers the crystal and smashes it. However, the Inquisitor can then investigate the shrine to find out, like, what is Corypheus keeping from her? Well, we know it's a lot. In the heart of the shrine, the Inquisitor discovers Magister Erasthenes himself, Calpurnia's former master. We learn that he's bound in a unique binding spell that inflicts tremendous pain whenever he attempts to lie or fails to reveal the entire truth. Inquisitor learns that the binding is only practice for what Corypheus intends for Calpurnia, and that Corypheus secretly intends to imprison and bind her as soon as she becomes the vessel, which would effectively re-enslave her to his will. So finding out all of that information is essential to the next place we see her, which is in the Arbor Wilds at the Temple of Mythal. When you can finally confront her, if you've gained the information about Erasthenes and Corypheus, you can tell her about Corypheus's plans to bind her like he did to his former master, or like he did to her former master. She's furious and literally leaves to confront Corypheus. And if you don't have this information on Erasthenes, Calpurnia will fight you, but then she eventually flees to a nearby ledge, proclaiming that she won't fall to the Inquisitor, and then she'll basically throw herself off the cliff, supposedly falling to her death. But I think it's very important to get this information so that you can then relay it to her, so then she can live and maybe go on to fix things in Tevinter.
So it's interesting to me because, so with Samson's side, you have the option to capture Samson and judge him. Is this not with Calpurnia?
Nope, you can't. And it's very interesting that that is the way it is, but their stories are totally different. So I think that makes sense. But I have 2 more quotes from Calpurnia that I wanted to read out, and then we can kind of have discussion time. The first one says this: Tevinter was the cradle of civilization. Imagine what her future could be. A crafter of wonders standing against the savage Qunari, a beacon for all. And the second quote is this: it doesn't have to be this way. The Empire used to be different. When a person's life was spent, it meant something. It bought something. If only slaves had a voice the Archon could hear. End quote. So, first question, what are your thoughts on Calpurnia? And then second question is, what do you think about her belief that Tevinter can be changed? Not necessarily restored to the Tevinter of old, but that Tevinter can be restored to a nation that values everyone's life.
Well, to the first question, I love Calpurnia. I think that I always say that siding with the mages is like what I feel like is the canon choice in Inquisition and what you would do. But on the flip side, I like the story and the characters of siding with the Templars so much better. Barris and Calpurnia and all of that. The quest I find more enjoyable, and it makes the game easier because the Venatori are a lot easier to take down than the Red Templars.
Right, definitely.
But this is the kind of the big question, and kind of hints at the question that I asked towards the beginning of the episode, which is Tevinter worthy of being redeemed in a point? Is it a point that it can be redeemed? And I think my gut tells me that Calpurnia is chasing a pipe dream, a false dream, a dream that's going to lead nowhere. Because there cannot be a Tevinter and slavery existing and a value of everyone's life. Because once you view someone as property, once you own another person, the value is not equal. There is no equality. There is no way you can frame that into a representation in which everyone's life is valued.
Right, exactly. I completely agree. Once you value someone as a thing to be owned, as something that can give you something only, something that you can force to do whatever you want, that is not a person. That is an object. And you can't ever have a country that means something, a country that values everyone's life, if you have a country that doesn't treat everyone as a human or as a person. I would also extend that to modern day countries. I'll leave it at that, and get back to Tevinter. But I think that Calpurnia is a very fascinating character, but I think she's delusional. I don't think there ever was a Tevinter that valued everyone's life. Tevinter is formed on the absolute annihilation and demolition of an entire country and culture. The elves of Arlathan and Elvenon. I don't think there was ever a Tevinter that valued people's lives. I mean, the first religion of Tevinter was a religion that worshipped the old gods that created the dark spawn and the blights. Like, this is not an innocent country. This is not a country that, oh, we love everybody, we're gonna sing kumbaya. That never existed. This is a country who colonized other places to then extract its population and turn them into slaves. Like, this is not a country that has innocence anywhere in its DNA. So I frankly don't know what she's on about with this whole a nation that values everyone's life business. I can understand how some Tevinters would want their country to be that. Absolutely get that. And I don't say any of my previous statement to say that all Tevinters think that way, but I think that its founding fathers, per se, its founding political leaders, its founding wars, establish a pattern. And I don't know if you can get away from that pattern once it's been created.
Right. I mean, just look at our own history.
Yeah.
And it has almost been in 40 years, we're going to be at 200 years past the abolition of slavery. Things are better. They're not great. They're better. They're different. But we still haven't figured out that.
Right. I mean, there's still deep oppression and injustice in every country. Our context is obviously the United States. And I mean, it's been 200 years for us, right? Well, it hasn't even been any time because Tevinter's always had slavery, like it's been thousands of years of Tevinter slavery. It took us a huge civil war that lasted a long time. And we only had slavery for I don't know if it actually hit 100 years or not, but around that time, around 100 years, I can't imagine how difficult it would be to have a civil war in Tevinter where they had slavery for over 1,000 years. Multiple thousands of years. I think maybe even 3,000 plus years.
Right, because the
I can't
ancient age
imagine.
is long.
Yeah, I can't imagine. So yeah, I don't know if Tevinter can be redeemed. I don't know if it can be restored. I know that I want Dorian and Maevaris to try. I know I want things to be better, but I don't know. It is a really complicated history.
And, we can talk about the elephant in the room in that, yes, Tevinter might have somewhat better treatment of mages if you're a magister or a child of a magister.
Right.
But at the same time, when you have a society that values blood magic so much that they're willing to just ignore, oh yeah, we've outlawed blood magic so that the Orlesians will get off our back. But we're still going to do it. At its core, blood magic is about controlling another person. Is about taking control, defying the laws of nature. That it doesn't lead to anything good.
No.
There are some things that are inherently evil, regardless of the intention of the user.
I agree. And I think slavery is one of those things. Which is why I hope that BioWare really takes its time has taken its time with the writing and has done justice to this topic and has not just sanitized and skimmed over the surface.
Me too. All right. Do you have any last thoughts?
I do not.
All right. Well, then we'll wrap up here. Thank you for sticking with us through this very heavy topic. Thank you for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We will see you next week. And a special thank you to Nug King Lewis H, who gets a special thank you at the end of every episode. So thank you all for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We will see you next week. Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
How well do you know your video game lovers?
Have you ever wondered how your video game bays stack up against all the other delectable digital dates?
I'm Genesis, the girl whose motto in life is love, laugh, tequila. And on Two Girls, One Ship, we analyze, rate, and review all that the world of video game romances has to offer.
And I'm Vervada, the hopeless romantic cat lady and lifelong gamer.
But you should know that our podcast centers on character and romance analysis and doesn't shy away from exploring the fun of physical connection.
Or from the deep emotional connections built between two characters, using specific in-game dialogue and the overall narrative journey. So join the Two Girls, One Ship shipsters, and remember,
beauty is in the eye of the controller.